Hi there and welcome to ET Now. I'm Ashwin Mohan and you're watching Amicus Curiae, where we get you the sharpest news and views from the world of corporate law, tax, regulatory affairs and mergers and acquisitions. This week, of course, the buzzword was the notification that came in from the IBBI, the Insolvency and Bankruptcy Board of India. This notification comes in on the back of the recently amended IBC ordinance by the government. Joining me to understand the nitty-gritties of some of the various norms that will affect all stakeholders in the IBC process is Kumar Saurabh, partner at Khaitan & Co. Kumar, thanks so much for taking out time and joining me on the show.
My pleasure.
Kumar, how important was it for the regulator, which is the IBBI, to immediately notify norms relating to the entire IBC process? It's almost a month after the ordinance. How crucial was it?
I think it was very, very important once you have brought ordinance while the parliament is not in session, and there were several provisions which required government to frame rules. It was very important that you actually bring the law in implementation, and the rules which have now got notified will fill that gap. So a lot of the changes which were introduced through ordinance required rules to be framed, and a quick framing of rules ultimately helps in implementing what you tried to address through the ordinance. So I think in that sense it's a move in the right direction. Lot of changes on the procedural side has been introduced in the code, and I think that will help in the overall streamlining of the process, because we are seeing lot of divergence of practices on account of lack of clarity on the regulations, and I think the intent is clearly to address difference in approaches which are being followed in different processes.
So basically to make it more consistent.
Absolutely.
All right. Now various classes of creditors, including home buyers, will now be allowed to seek relief under the law as financial creditors. That's also part of the notification of the IBBI. Kumar, this will go a long way in creating a level playing field, right?
Yes, I mean, in a way, yes, it creates level playing field. You empower the home buyers, you bring them in the committee of creditors, you give them right to initiate insolvency process. The real estate industry will have to learn and unlearn its practices when it comes to dealing with the customers. So in that sense, it obviously creates that level playing field between the consumer and the developer. I mean, will it have any other consequence vis-a-vis the other stakeholders in a real estate company, mainly being the financiers? How do they get affected by this empowerment? Does it create instability in the short run in the real estate industry?
Right.
Possible outcomes, but in the long run, I think it creates that level playing field, which will be a good supplement to what RERA intended to do, which was to empower the hands of the consumers. And I think this is a step in that direction, going a step further to create a further level playing field.
A significant change in the entire the power dynamics in the real estate sector. And as you correctly pointed out, RERA of course was more consumer focused, and this ensures that home buyers are not at the receiving end of any resolution process. But is this how Kumar, home buyers are treated overseas as well, or has India charted a path of its own?
I think, consumers in that sense are not treated as at par with creditors in lot of jurisdictions. So in that sense, we have departed. Consumers are not always treated at par. But some of the other jurisdictions, it's also not a very fair comparison, because you have faster law enforcement processes available for consumers in some of those jurisdictions. So once you realize that in India you have delays which may happen in consumer litigations, the faster way to address it, bring everyone in the insolvency process, empower the home buyers, because otherwise you see the amount of delays which is there in the real estate industry. I mean, it's a big concern from the policy maker side, and this is intended to bring that discipline. But as I was saying earlier, in the short run it can create disruption, and particularly for cases where financing has not factored a class of stakeholder with such a critical right. Clearly from lenders perspective, this changes the dynamics, and the manner of resolution now will have to be more holistic. So you have to clearly address the concerns of home buyers who were earlier only treated at par with other creditors.
Right.
In an industry like real estate, when home buyers should be central to the whole resolution process, I think this step will reiterate that focus and will make sure that any resolution which is approved by the COC addresses the concerns of home buyers.
as well.
Or in the alternate, you refund the money. So these are the two options. So I think from that perspective, it sends the right signal.
And I think it was inevitable also, because there was a lot of litigation concerning the recent JP case at the Supreme
Absolutely.
Court, and there was a lot of controversy around it.
And the message from the Supreme Court and other courts were clear that there is a gap in law which needs to be filled
up.
And this step really fills that gap.
Now let's move on to another very important stakeholder in the entire IBC process, which is the IRP, the Insolvency Resolution Professional. And we have seen a lot of live cases wherein there's tremendous pressure on the IP. He's being torn in different directions, and he of course does have a very critical role to play, the role between the suitors and the target company. Now the notification from the IBBI says that a resolution professional should determine whether a corporate debtor has indulged in fraudulent transactions within a specified time period during the resolution process. Now, has this time frame been specified in the fine print, Kumar, and don't you think this is a bit of an onerous responsibility for an IRP who's already dealing with so much?
So yes, I mean clearly this seems to be putting IRP in a very unenviable position. On one side you have time bound resolution process where also the regulations prescribe for timelines, and this whole process of determining whether there are fraudulent or preferential transactions then in some ways puts the pressure on the resolution professional. Where does he focus? Does he focus on resolution, which was the primary objective?
Or does he focus on ring fencing himself?
Ring fencing himself, or does he focus on what has happened in the company in the past? That is important, but I mean putting this kind of a timeline is really going to put lot of pressure on the resolution professional, and I would have liked it to be more prescriptive, but now it looks like it is more mandatory. So some of the things are mandatory, and where this is not in a situation to be complied with, then of course courts will have to intervene and give additional time. But a 75-day timeline to determine, you have to do the entire audit process and you have to take a decision on the basis of that audit process. I think it is putting the onus on the resolution professional to really speeden up things. In practice, if it can happen, nothing like it, but we will get to know, I mean, if it is so, it is going to happen so quickly, because in some of the other cases, the current cases, the pace at which some of these things have been moving has been a bit slow, and because of which there may be a need felt to speeden up things, but then there are practical problems in determining transactions for which some of which there is no time frame also prescribed under the code. So if you have to go back to a 5-year, 7-year transaction, it will take time. And
not always do you find a situation wherein the IRP, the bankers are perhaps on the same line of thinking. There could be a difference of opinion and maybe differing legal opinions as well.
Yes, absolutely. So, I mean, it's going to be a challenging timeline to comply with, but the objective seems to be very clear, that put a time frame, because if you don't have it, then things can get delayed.
So the intentions are noble, but there is going to be far greater accountability from this moment onwards on your average IRP.
Absolutely.
All right. Now, Kumar, the IBBI notification also says wherever the corporate debtor has classes of creditors having at least 10 creditors in the class, then the IRP shall offer a choice of 3 insolvency professionals to act as the authorized representative of the creditors in each class, right? The insolvency professional, who is the choice of the highest number of creditors in the class, shall be appointed as the authorized representative of the creditors of the respective class. What's the rationale behind this move, and how is it different from the earlier regime? Is it to ensure that every class gets their exclusive representative?
See, I think this is again a response to in increasing that category of financial creditors to include home buyers. I mean, it's a large pool of
it's a consequence
creditors.
of that.
Yeah, it could be one consequence of that. You have a large pool of financial creditors in a real estate company. Would you bring everyone to the discussion table, give everyone a seat on the table? That may not be very efficient.
That will be chaotic.
Yeah, that will be chaotic, and you are prescribing for timelines on the other hand for running the process in a manner where you would want limited number of decision makers.
So consensus building is most important.
Consensus building is most important. So I think this is again trying to preemptively address the problem by enlarging enlarging the pool of financial creditors, even amongst the class of bond holders. I think that this concern is always there. Can you get everyone at decision making will slow down, and from a point of moving quickly, unless you have a representative nominee coming and attending these meetings, you can probably open resolution professional to more challenge in terms of the decision and the manner in which the meetings are conducted. So I think this is a good move to streamline the process.
Looking at the entire aspect of out of court settlement of cases, for example, if A and B get into a corporate insolvency resolution process and suddenly they decide that maybe let's not go ahead and go the whole hog, let's withdraw the application. Now, of course, that is something that has to be regulated in a disciplined manner, and which is the reason why now the IBBI notification says that the committee of creditors shall consider the application for withdrawal within 7 days of its constitution or 7 days of receipt of the application, whichever is later. So you have 1 week to decide. That is the breather period. You have to decide whether or not you want to continue or whether you want to withdraw. If the application is approved, of course, by 90% voting of the COC. How helpful will this be to facilitate out of court settlements? Do you think this 1 week period is enough?
I think one again, the intent is to prescribe a time, and lot of these timelines will have to be looked at practically, and you may have to give extensions. But the larger point under the ordinance and now what is prescribed through the regulations is the fact that you are giving an opportunity to withdraw an application which had led to admission of the company into insolvency. I think that is a very significant move. Supreme Court in multiple cases had been indicating to government that why is everyone coming to us? You create a process for withdrawal. If the insolvency can be addressed, you create a process of withdrawal. And I think this is a move in that direction, that at least you give an option. Up to what stage you give an option? When the earlier ordinance came, the thinking seemed to be that after 1 year up to post the NPA, the existing promoters and management have a chance to salvage the company. After that, it goes into insolvency.
Right.
Here, this in a way gives a longer room up to the time that expression of interest is invited. If the existing promoters are in a position to negotiate a settlement with the committee of creditors and the applicant who had taken the company to insolvency, one should be able to come out. So from that perspective, I think it's a good move. The only point to note is if you look at the ordinance and the regulation, there seem to be a slight difference in terms of the wording on when these regulations become effective. The ordinance indicated that it is effective all at once. The regulation says only for cases which commence on or after the date of the regulation. So what do you do about the existing cases? The existing cases also perhaps may need this kind of clarity and solution, where say an application got admitted on 25th June, which was after the ordinance but before the regulations, you are leaving that out. So I think there is a case to consider aligning the regulations to the ordinance and leaving it to the parties to decide whether they want to permit withdrawal or not. Otherwise, this kind of inconsistency doesn't serve the purpose. It's not good for anyone if you want to have such an option in law.
So this grey area currently exists, and the government should definitely address it.
It's a point to be considered.
All right. Clear timelines have also been put in place for the entire insolvency resolution process and the roadmap that has to be followed by the resolution professionals. So now IRPS, according to the IBBI notification, have to publish an EOI by the 75th day from the insolvency commencement date, and also publish a provisional list of prospective applicants within 10 days from the EOI submission deadline. Again, more and more dates being prescribed. I think the IBBI and also the government would have seen the manner in which many of the live cases have proceeded. Because let's be very frank, dates and deadlines haven't really been respected by many parties in the IBC. Are they trying to now pin down particular dates so that there is a semblance of discipline at least? Because as I was pointing out, many stakeholders haven't really taken these dates very seriously.
I would put it a bit differently. If you look at the code prescribes for 180 days, extendable up to 270 days for the overall insolvency resolution. RBI in context of pre-insolvency restructurings used to prescribe timelines, and every stage the timeline to be followed. Then they realized that probably it is not the best way, so they gave a consolidated timeline, say for SDR cases 210 days instead of breaking it into 90, 90, 30. Now here we see a reverse approach. Within the 180 days you are prescribing the timelines to be followed. Now what does this mean? Our experience of last 18 months has been that in lot of cases timelines have been extended and 180 became 270. By prescribing shorter deadlines for every stage, I don't think that per se will address the problem of capacity. Okay. I think today there is a large number of cases that bankers are facing. The resolution professional himself may be involved in multiple cases, and the decision making to some extent gets delayed on account of capacity and decision making bringing everyone together, and from that perspective merely prescribing timeline may not address the problem, but I think it's an indication of the fact that the government wants things to move in a time bound manner, and that time bound manner cannot be that you only look at 180th day whether it is achievable or not. You follow a certain discipline, which is good. I mean, in this kind of a process it's good to have timelines, but whether it can be actually be implemented so strictly, or you go by the approach which is there in one of the regulations that it's a model timeline. So model timeline is good to have, but may not always be followed. That could be the other approach.
No, but at least there is a blueprint in place.
Yes, there is a blueprint,
and it remains to be seen.
Yes,
whether the stakeholders want to risk not following these timelines.
Absolutely, and I would say the intent has never been to not follow. Intent has always been to follow, but there are circumstances, there are competitive interests as play, there has been litigation, so all those factors cause delay and challenge to decisions of RP at different stages. All that leads to delay, but I think it's a good thing to have a system in place which prescribes timeline, and people, wherever you can't comply, you approach the authority and
maybe seek an exemption.
An extension.
Kumar, hold on to your thoughts. It's time now to slip into a short break. Stay tuned and keep watching Amicus Curiae. We continue to analyze the impact of the notification that has come in recently from the Insolvency and Bankruptcy Board of India. Stay tuned. Welcome back to Amicus Curiae, where I'm joined by Kumar, Saurabh, partner Khaitan and Co. Kumar, another aspect of the IBBI notification, which is a very interesting one, because I'm wondering whether it can be implemented in on the ground, is the fact that they now want the resolution plan to address, or they want the resolution plan to demonstrate that it addresses the cause of default, and also that the applicant has the capability to implement the plan amongst others. This could be a little difficult for your regular suitor, because if the cause of default is unexpected business cycles or a slowdown, how does he address that?
I think cause of default again would have to be interpreted purposely. Cause of default is going back to the past. Rather, you will have to see whether the insolvency resolution can be sustainable in terms of the future business plan, future projections to turn around the business, which can address the reasons for why the company went into insolvency. I think that has to be done instead of prescribing that cause of default needs to be addressed, because cause of default may not be in the control of the decision makers and the bidder in every situation. So that's a point that needs to be taken note of. But in the overall context of resolution, and which is already happening, what is required to be demonstrated? Your ability to address the default, the reasons which cause the problem is not the concern. The clear concern is that the liabilities which are there in the company can that be addressed in a way that you can keep the company as a going concern? And that would presuppose determination of the projections that you are giving, the business plan. Is there a change in approach which can possibly lead to a resolution? Can you do the business in a way which may be different than what was happening? Those are things which will have to be shown. You will have to show the strength of your management team. You will have to indicate what are the sources of funds which you are relying on to implement the plan. I think that is broadly the intent, and in practice that is already happening. The committee of creditors is looking at some of these key financial capabilities and operational and managerial capabilities.
Over and above just the valuation.
Absolutely,
right?
Absolutely. That is addressed in the evaluation matrix which is prescribed by IBA, and banks are following in all cases. So I think by and large this is in line with it, and some of the language will have to be purposely interpreted.
You know, Kumar, two areas which have caused the maximum amount of litigation in the IBC so far. One, this whole controversy around whether or not you should entertain late bids. Second one, this whole concept of maximization of value. How far can you stretch it? We were all expecting that to find some place in the amended IBC ordinance. But my understanding is that the government has passed it on to the IBBI. I don't really find those aspects specifically dealt with in the notification. So is that something which we can expect at a later stage? Because that at the end of the day is, those are the two biggest issues which have caused litigation, and they remain specifically unaddressed, at least in the ordinance and in this notification.
So on the timelines, I mean, late bids coming in, I think by prescribing for a timeline and putting the onus on RP and COC to adhere to timelines, I think the onus is now on them to clearly take a position that if you run a process, if you give any extensions, that should be transparent. I mean, somewhere in the regulations also prescribe, if you call for fresh bids, you give opportunity to everyone. So I think the onus will be on the stakeholders. I mean, government through rules to prescribe that don't take late bids or take late bids, I think would end up creating more rules and more litigation. If you follow a process and you keep it open, I mean, wherever there is extension being given, one way to address it is give option to others also. If anyone else wants to submit revised bid, that could
but
be
the whole aspect is then this becomes a never-ending story.
This becomes
how long do you keep throwing the logic of maximization of value? Of course, that's good news for the bankers involved, because they can stay back and the bidders can keep fighting amongst themselves. But how long do you stress this?
I agree, and I think there is already a lot of activism on that front. If you look at several cases, I mean, I am not taking particular names, but you started with case of some of the bidders trying to come with a bid after possibly seeing what were the valuations. But you see the improvements now coming in the method of bidding also. You have seen Swiss challenge already being used in some cases. So I think some of this bidding challenges which is there will have to be addressed once you learn how the process has played out, and maybe there will be more clarification coming out from IBBI. But I think already banks are adopting the best practices from other markets also, and eventually it seems like it may move towards electronic bidding. That could be
that will be crystal clear.
That will make it crystal clear, make it completely transparent, give opportunity.
So the buck should stop with the IRP, right? Because at the end of the day, the banks might be playing the silent watching game, because they know that the more the entire resolution process continues, perhaps the lesser their haircut and the more aggressive the bids. So it is the IRP who has to eventually step in and say it stops here, right?
They have to, but I mean, if you look at the scheme of the code, it is clearly a creditor in possession model. So creditors will have a say. You can't completely take them out of the equation. Ultimately, they have their interest is paramount in this whole resolution, and that's why it's a creditor in possession model. You have completely taken away shareholders.
Is e-bidding followed in other jurisdictions, Kumar?
In some of the other jurisdictions, yes.
And what's been the experience so far?
I mean, if you look at an advanced jurisdiction like US, you have a e-bidding system which works very well. So I think some of the matured markets, but again you have to go back to the point that these are jurisdictions where the law was also introduced earlier. You learn out of experience, you go through this process of litigation, and this will probably lead to a path where there will be consensus amongst the bankers, amongst the professionals, and among the bidding community also, that you follow a system which is more transparent. And if it can't be addressed, then you will have Supreme Court stepping in and giving directions which will then become binding on everyone. So I think both from government and judiciary side, time is being given for people to follow a very transparent process. But if there is challenges which are coming in the way of faster implementation, then you will see rule making either from judiciary or from government side.
Absolutely. I think you hit the nail on the head. If the government doesn't come out with rules that are indeed proving to be roadblocks in a particular policy, then I guess the Supreme Court has no choice but to step in. But I hope that doesn't happen, and some of these issues get sorted out and weeded out by the government and the regulator in the coming days, especially some of the ones which you have referred to.
Absolutely. And I would have probably wanted all the changes which were introduced through the ordinance to be applicable in all the cases. Why do you leave out the existing cases? Because if the object is indeed what is prescribed in the ordinance, it is as much required to be followed in all cases, and you can probably get a better result. So I think that's another point which needs to be considered.
Right. Kumar, thanks so much for joining me yet again on an IBC special and sharing your perspective. Always a pleasure having you on the show.
Thank you very much.
With that, it's a wrap on this edition of Amicus Curiae. Thanks so much for tuning in. This is Ashwin Mohan signing off. I'll see you next week.